Hello everyone and welcome to Off the Drawing Board, the official Sheffield University Architecture Society podcast. I am Daphne and today I am delighted to be welcoming Leo Kerr to the podcast studio. Welcome, Leo.
Hi, Daphne.
It is lovely having you in the studio, Leo, and thank you very much for joining us today. Leo is a Sheffield-based architect, and today we are going to be discussing the open house co-housing project. But before we dive into the main episode, I would like to invite you to tell us a bit about yourself, Leo, and your architectural journey so far.
Right. Well, yes, I studied in Sheffield for my undergraduate degree course and came back to do my master's as well. So I'm very much invested in Sheffield as the university and the city. It's a place that I've lived for a long time and that I love, and brought up a family here as well. So it's very much a part of my life and my family.
And you are also working in Sheffield as an architect, apart from being a member of the university, aren't you?
Yes, so I'm a director in the Charles Everton Care Architects, which is local practice, been running for a number of years. We are quite small, but I think we like to think that we sort of punch above our weight and are able to contribute to kind of broader architecture discussion.
It is great to see local architects as well working in Sheffield and having projects around this area. I think it's really beneficial for students at the University of Sheffield. And we also know you're the Year 3 program leader and co-director of LiveWorks, which is a very important aspect of the University of Sheffield Architecture School.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've talked about this before on another podcast, actually, but LiveWorks is something that I set up with Carolyn Butterworth 10 years ago this year. And it's really to explore further opportunities for students to work in live ways, or what we call engaged learning, where they're working with people from outside the university on real issues in real time. But those sort of opportunities for students to engage in real life issues and projects is something that I try to kind of follow through with in all aspects of what I do.
That sounds perfect, and that's really helpful for all of our students, I reckon. Now, we will begin with a few quick questions just to break the ice before we dive into the main episode. So my first question for you, Leo, is why did you choose architecture as a topic?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I suppose my story is like many others in that it's something that I was interested in from a very early age. And it's a kind of a bit of a joke in my family, really, how early I was interested in architecture. I think the reasons for my interest in architecture have obviously changed and evolved over time. But I think initially when I was at primary school, I loved the precision of the drawing. I remember there was a project to develop the school buildings and somebody put the drawings up on the wall. And I just remember seeing them and thinking how amazing they were and how detailed they were, and the potential for that to turn into something real was absolutely fascinating to me. And I think that was kind of the source of my interest initially.
It must be beautiful now that you can actually see projects being pragmatized in real life.
Yes, and with the open house project, which we'll go on to talk about, I think that is one of the wonderful things, is to be able to conceive something, to create a drawing which might take you a small amount of time, a sketch, a three-dimensional drawing, representation of what something might be like, and then 10 years later that comes to fruition and reality and someone's living there, and we even look back at the original drawings and go, that wasn't too far off actually, that's pretty good. So it really brings that home, the importance of it, and architects' ability to have a vision and to be able to realise that it's not really something many other people can do.
It feels fantastic to be able to implement your ideas and see them come to life. And then something that kind of links back to why did you choose architecture is, how was your first experience as an architect when you were a Part 1 student, or maybe even in practice?
Yeah, so as I said before, I studied at Sheffield on the architecture degree course and really enjoyed that for lots of different reasons. On completion of that, I went to work in a sort of fairly sort of corporate regional practice, and it was a really good experience of that kind of work, but it wasn't really the architecture that I wanted to do, and it wasn't a way of doing architecture that I wanted to pursue. But I think it was incredibly useful as a learning journey as part of that, and I often say that to students now, is that if you're not sure that architecture is for you, doing that kind of working practice is so important, and it might teach you what you don't want to do as much as what you do. And so I think it's an incredibly rich experience, even if it's not the one that you intended or not exactly what you thought it was going to be.
Especially in Part 1 level, when you don't really have that much of a say in what you want to choose.
Yes. I remember starting work, and within the first couple of weeks I kind of realised that there wasn't a lot of kind of recycling going on in the office and this sort of thing. And I made a suggestion to one of my bosses that it might be worth considering. And I was kind of really, it didn't really go very far. And I was pretty much told to kind of get on with it and be quiet. So, yeah, you learn a lot. And some things are really positive and others maybe not. So.
It is a really good learning curve, though, and at least it teaches you, as you said, to know what you like and what you want to get out of architecture. So it's still a really important experience.
Absolutely.
Perfect. And lastly, I would like to ask you if you've got any tips or personal suggestions for our Year 3 students, since you're the Year 3 leader as well, and they're ready to go into practice. I think that it would be really beneficial to hear some of your suggestions on what they should do when they get out to practice.
I think following on from what I've said, really, I try not to talk about myself too much when I'm giving advice to people, but I think sometimes we can build up that year in practice too much, or students think that they have to go to a practice that they've heard of, or a named practice, or somebody that's kind of high profile. And I don't think that's always necessary, and that's not always where you get the best experience as well. So I think it's important to have that experience, but not to worry too much about exactly where that is or the profile of the people that you're working with, because you learn so much from that, and there's so much to be gained through just experiencing different types of architecture and how that works. So I sort of encourage people to do that, but also I think situations changed a lot since my time, which was a while ago now, and I think our graduates, we encourage them to think about the agency that they may have in practice. And I think because of the way organisations work in this day and age, I'd like to think that graduates, Part 1 students, do have a slightly bigger voice than perhaps they did a number of years ago, that there may be more opportunities for them to be listened to and for their early learning in their degree to be taken forward and to influence people they're working with, maybe in a very small but important way. That's part of the advice that I would give as well, is to keep trying and to, value your experience and value what you can bring to a practice, rather than thinking that you are at the bottom rung of the ladder, because I think you've still got lots of things to contribute in many different ways.
This is really useful, especially for the students that believe that being a Part 1 is a really insignificant part of a practice, whereas usually they are kind of the jack of all trades. They do so many things and they can contribute in ways that maybe older architects cannot even imagine, because they've got different experiences from the university, especially Sheffield, where you learn a lot of multidisciplinary things and you've got so much experience from the course itself. You jump in and you've got so many things to offer.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I suppose with Part 1 students in practice, it's a bit like teaching students in the course, say in first year. What it forces us to do as teachers and architects is to think about where we were, what we were thinking, how we were learning at those kind of early stages of our education. And what that does is enables one as a teacher and an architect to reflect more on what we do, why we do it, what we mean by what we say, which is incredibly important, because, we do get wrapped up in jargon and language that we've sort of inherited and used over the years. And I think it's really important to question that and to ask ourselves why we use that language, why we say those things and what it means, and try to explain that clearly. And I think when you're working with a younger person, somebody that's earlier in their education and learning, to reflect on that and to kind of question why we do things is really important. And I think that is part of the value of teaching for me as a teacher, but it's also part of value of a Part 1 student or a student in first year, is to kind of prompt people that are maybe more senior or their kind of teachers to really think about that and to reflect on what they do know.
A fresh perspective is always really beneficial for any type of practice, and I think that links quite well to an earlier episode we had with Sam Brown and Adriana Macida on liveness, because architecture is something live and it should evolve. And when you do not have any kind of evolution, it's a static thing. It doesn't really have any promotion of new ideas, new perspectives, new architectural projects. You just have a repetition, a self-referring architecture. So that's really useful to know. So after this wonderful introduction, I think it is time to jump into our main episode. Now, Leo, a wonderful project that you have been co-founder of. It's the Open House co-housing project. This is located locally in Sheffield, outskirts of Sheffield. So before we talk about the actual project, maybe our listeners should know, what is co-housing exactly?
Yes, so co-housing comes in lots of different forms and shapes and organisations, but I think fundamentally it's about people that come together to live an intentional community of varying sizes, but people that are wanting to come together to live in their own houses, but to share some facilities and to support each other in a number of different ways. So that's the kind of social idea, if you like, which is something that many people have decided is something that they want to try and to experience. I think the origins of co-housing really come from Northern Europe, perhaps, and Scandinavia, where there's some fantastic examples of co-housing at quite large scales. I think in the UK we're pretty slow in developing co-housing. That could be partly cultural, it could be partly financial and social. I think one of the main differences between co-housing and, say, housing cooperative, for instance, is that everybody lives in their own house and owns their own house. But then you have a range of shared facilities to work with around that, which is really helpful in lots of different ways. So that's the kind of at the heart of it. I think some co-housing groups sort of move into finished buildings, so you get a group of people moving into a sort of development that's already been completed. Some others may undertake processes of self-build or go through the process of finding a site, developing the buildings and then living in them, which is sometimes described as collective custom build or similar sort of phrases such as that. So you do get different forms of procurement or different ways of developing the co-housing. And as I said, that ranges from across lots of different sort of scales and sizes, really.
The idea of co-housing is in itself really different to what we're used to in the UK, I believe, because we've got a lot of terraced houses or apartment blocks. And you see this situation where people live right next to each other, but they might have little to no interactions in day-to-day life. So bringing together a community is kind of like the architecture uniting the people, isn't it, in one project?
Yep, absolutely. And I think there's, as you say, there's lots of different forms of housing in the UK. And I think particularly in Sheffield, the sort of typical Sheffield terrace housing is really interesting in its social makeup. We often have the alleyways or jennels, as they're called in Sheffield, I believe, which often mean that people use their back door as their main door. So you often have these sort of alleyways that people come down to access the houses, and in order to do that they're usually a set of 4 houses, say, so it means that somebody to get to a house on the end needs to walk across somebody else's garden or in front of their door in order to get to the house. So there are lots of different interactions, but sometimes those can be really important to build a sense of community, and other times they can be a source of contention and problems. So I think with co-housing in particular, it's about people doing that, deciding to be involved in something like that deliberately, and because they want an additional level of kind of social interaction and support.
This is probably quite differentiated from what we see in day-to-day life in Sheffield.
Yeah. No, I think people are quite protective of their houses in the UK, and that may be different to other parts of the world. And so I think it challenges us a little bit to think about how we occupy how we inhabit our house, our place, and how we share, those outdoor spaces, other facilities with other people. So it's a really interesting way of living, and it's as challenging as it is enjoyable, really.
We do tend to be a bit individualistic nowadays, but we have to remember that in older times and in many European cities, the central courtyard with houses around it to interact was quite common.
Yes, absolutely. And I think those sort of communal spaces, housing around a courtyard, shared areas, is incredibly important. It's something that we've tried to develop, actually, through our project.
So now that we have a clear definition of what co-housing is, I think it's time to introduce the Open House Co-housing project. So from what I understand, the project has utilized the site of a historic farm.
Yes.
So, Leo, tell us about the story of this farm.
I mean, maybe just kind of the origins of the project would be useful to explain to give you an idea of that, Daphne. We started thinking about a more sort of communal way of living probably about 14 years ago. So it's been a long time coming together. Our project is an extended family and friends co-housing project. So all the people involved are people that we are either related to or know or have known previously, which is different to other co-housing models. So this is a very particular version of it. So we started a long time ago talking about the possibility of living together or with other people, with my parents, other people of different sort of generations, and talking about what the benefit of that could be and how it might work. And we didn't really know what that could be, what the possibilities were. But through conversations, we started thinking about how we might achieve that, what the scale of it would be, how we would actually go about doing something like that. Because myself and my wife lived in Sheffield already, we obviously knew it a little bit in terms of what the possibilities were. Compared to some other places in the country, the land values were perhaps, or the property values were a little bit better than in some other areas, but still very difficult to buy a plot of land or a place to be able to do a development in popular neighbourhoods or in the city centre, because bigger developers just snap those places up or land bank them in other ways. So very difficult to kind of get started. So we then started looking at places where we might be able to start or to think about possibilities of it. And it was quite interesting that there was a number of farmsteads that were on the market at the time, and this was kind of 2007, I guess, 2008 when we started looking. So there was also the financial crash that had happened, so it created a really interesting set of opportunities. We looked at a few different kind of farmsteads, and they became interesting to us because they were available. And when you start to look at them, they basically are made up of a series of buildings, usually around a farmyard or a sort of central place. And that immediately kind of got our interest. It was also useful because they tended to be on the urban fringe of the city. So they had a bit of a best of both worlds in the sense that they still had good transport links into the city centre, but also a bit more space for us to be able to maybe grow things or develop sort of a bit more outdoor space that we could share. So that was something that we were quite interested in, particularly the older people in the group who were maybe thinking about a different phase of their lives to some of us. So that's where we started looking, really. And we came across Barnshall Farm, where we've ended up living and developing through that search. And the other thing about farms is that they're usually, the quality of the architecture and the buildings is pretty low. And no offence to kind of farmers, but they're built out of practicality. They're utilitarian buildings, which are usually fairly cheaply, economically put up in order to work. And crucially, they're usually designed for animals rather than people. So they present a number of challenges. So we looked at different places that didn't quite work. When we went to Barnshall Farm, we realised that we'd come across a set of buildings that were a much greater quality, architectural quality. We also knew that because two of them were listed. So we recognised that that was something of real sort of heritage and architectural value. But conversely, that also meant that it was a challenge for a traditional developer, because that tends to eat into your profit margins and can cause problems when you have buildings of historic value that need a lot of work doing to them or need to be developed in a different way.
It is really difficult to work with listed buildings as well, because you've got a lot of pressure from planners or from historic England. So you don't really have the ability to do whatever you want with them. And you've got to be really specific or suggest in a very beneficial way for the building itself, so that you ensure that its historic integrity remains intact.
Absolutely. So that is a lot of work. I think one of the things about listed buildings is they tend to cost more to develop or to renovate. But once you've done that, the value of it is really powerful, I think, in terms of heritage terms, but also, in terms of the kind of culture and the sense that you're keeping something alive or keeping the spirit of something. And I think also we were quite lucky in a sense, or the nature of the buildings, because they're farm buildings. They're listed because of their kind of collection and the quality of the construction, which are these kind of stone built barns which also have some historic kind of roof structures within them, but they're quite robust. They don't have many fixtures and fittings. There's no kind of plaster cornices to worry about, so they're very basic. So in a sense, as long as we kept the integrity of that and sort of really celebrated the kind of nature of the barns, the kind of volumes and that basic construction, then that was something that would be recognised.
I think the existing buildings must have had their own beauty as well, like, the stone structure, this very simplistic yet really eye-catching type of building. It must be really interesting to live in it as well when you have converted it, of course, and made it inhabitable, because, as you mentioned, it's not created per se for human inhabitation. It's meant for animals or for storage purposes as well. So you've already touched on it, but this sounds like this project, because it was not meant for human habitation, it was just farm spaces, must have had its own challenges when putting down the plans, when creating building regulations, also due to the fact that some of the buildings were listed. So what were the main challenges you encountered when going through those applications and that design stage?
So there was a number of challenges in relation to that. Part of the reason we were attracted to the site was it already had planning permission to convert the buildings into houses. It was roughly the right number, so that suited us, and it meant that we didn't have to start from scratch. However, the design of those houses wasn't what we wanted, so it was quite a good opportunity. So we knew there was the potential there and that there was the principle of developing them was there, which helped us a lot. But then we developed a scheme that worked for us. And that was really interesting because, as we were saying before about my interest in kind of participatory design processes, working with people, working with my family, working with friends to develop a sort of scheme that we were interested in, and we didn't have enough people to fill all the houses, and we're still searching for someone for the last one. So that meant that some of the buildings we were designing for ourselves or for specific people within the group, and others we were thinking about more speculatively or more broadly of how someone might live in there. So that was really interesting. So we needed to take that into account as we were developing the design and the scheme. But interestingly, through the planning process, when we put in our design for what we wanted, there was actually an intervention during the planning period whereby a local group of people that were involved in the planning process came and visited the site, and they actually then got in contact with English Heritage England, because they felt that more of the buildings should be listed and recognised than we're currently. So we then had to have quite a difficult process whereby we had to wait for that. Then we had to think about how we adapted the design to take that into account. Fortunately, we were able to kind of make the case for what we were already intending to do, but that was another barrier along the way. There's also all sorts of things, thinking about the kind of ecological issues, so existing kind of species and animals living in the buildings, bats and other such things. So thinking about that side of things, we also had, because the buildings, some of them have been there for nearly 400 years, so we also had kind of archaeological issues to take into account and had to undertake archaeological work during the process, all of which added to the cost and could have been really challenging. But I think, we tried to handle those in the right way and deal with it properly, but also try and make it part of the journey rather than seeing it as a kind of problem.
I think, as you mentioned, there are so many aspects when you're designing with such buildings that are already existing, but also have so many parameters. For instance, they are listed, they are located in a space where fauna and flora is surging. It's not in the middle of the city, it's in the outskirts of Sheffield, as you mentioned. So there are many parameters that you have to take into account. That's kind of the beauty and the challenge of architecture, that you have to tackle one by one all the issues, and it makes it really personalised by the end of the project.
Yeah. I think in a traditional sort of procurement or development, all those things would be seen and calculated financially and weighed up and decided upon whether it was worth it or not. And I think for us, the financial side is incredibly important because we don't have a lot of money, or didn't have a lot of money to be able to lose, and we had to be very careful about that. But I think we had the opportunity to see these things as adding value to what we're doing, but also it's cliched, but the project is about the journey. It's about the experiences that happened, good and bad, throughout it, and that's something that then as a group becomes part of our shared history, and kind of this sort of adds to the sort of the culture of the group in a way, which I think is really important. At the time, you're not always thinking that way. You're not always thinking, oh, this is a great experience, because it's difficult. But I think when you reflect on that and look back on it, I think it just adds to what we've achieved. And then when you're sat in your house or whatever else and you're looking around, it adds to the value that you see in it and the enjoyment of living there, I think.
Absolutely, especially since it's family and friend oriented, as you mentioned. I think that creates a really beautiful lore, not only to the family, but to the building itself.
Yeah.
So you've got things to narrate when people are there. And also something that I found really beautiful and touching was the website itself for the open house project. It's got this little blog of updates of how the process was going. And there were so many beautiful elements into it, rather than just plainly saying planning permission did not go through yet, we did not build anything, it's been going slow. It had some really small but beautiful elements to it, like we planted a pine tree, or we are taking out the grass from this area and we're doing this and that, which is really beautiful.
we've tried to be fairly honest with the website in different ways, and I think you're right. There are lots of moments there and things that we've tried to do which are part of what makes the group and makes the project interesting, and they involve different people. And I think I'm here talking about the project, but there's a dozen people that could be sat here telling you a different version, including some of my kids who would probably see it very differently.
Of course, there is different perspective to everything, isn't it? But that's part of the beauty. You've got many perspectives, and now because it's a cluster of houses, you've got different points of view from each one perhaps, and you've got different people living in it but coming together as a community, which is lovely. And I also know that there is a sustainability part to the project. Despite all the difficulties, you did manage to create a really sustainable project. So tell us about it.
Yeah, so we very much wanted the project to be as sustainable as possible. The idea of renovating a listed farmstead in itself, I think, is a kind of sustainable act. Ideally, if it could have been used for farming, that would have been the best thing to do, but it wasn't needed for that and wasn't necessarily appropriate for modern farming anymore. So adapting that, creatively reusing the buildings in itself, I think is really important, because it wasn't necessarily financially viable for a developer to do that in traditional ways. So it needed an alternative approach, we thought, to look at it. So I think that act in itself, I hope, is sustainable and something that adds value and secures the future of these buildings, or just the next phase of their lives anyway, seeing as some of them have been there for 400 years or so already. So I think that in itself was important. We also, the communal nature of the project extends to things like the heating system, for instance. So we were looking at incorporating a district heating system, which we've now installed in the majority of the buildings, particularly the ones around the farmyard. So I think the heating system now supports 6 buildings on the site, and we were looking at different methods for heating and hot water at the beginning, which is a big part of the project, and eventually we hit upon using ground source heat pump for that, which turned out, I think, a very good decision. So that's a major element of the project in a sense. So we have a 75-metre deep borehole where we extract water from, we bring that up, we take the heat out of that, which we then exchange and heat the water for the underfloor heating, which runs through all of the buildings, and for the domestic hot water as well. So when you turn the tap on, and the hot water that comes out. So that's been a big part of what we do. Because we've had to do the development in phases, we've only really done 1, sometimes 2 buildings at a time. So having a district heating system and then adding houses onto that as we go created a lot of infrastructural challenges. But what it meant was that we needed to be really careful about the thermal performance of the houses. If we got it wrong, then the heating system wouldn't be powerful enough to heat the buildings and the houses properly, which obviously would make people very grumpy. So getting that right was a big planning exercise, and what that has meant is that we've had to insulate all the buildings to a very similar level in order to enable the heating to work in a similar way. All of the ground floors are a solid kind of construction to enable the underfloor heating to work appropriately, and therefore there's no carpets, things like that, which is kind of something that's, some people are not that keen on, but once you feel the kind of warmth of the buildings through that, then that's often kind of forgotten about. So there are a number of kind of key design issues that span from thinking about that process, and I think generally it's worked very well. It's really interesting on a communal level as well, when you've got heating, hot water, and our drinking water for most of the houses comes from that borehole, and I think there is a nice collectiveness to that. Whereas if everybody had their own gas boiler in their houses, if one of them goes wrong, it doesn't really affect anybody else, and we're all in it together. So if there's any problems with it or there's any kind of benefits from it, then we kind of in that together. And that's quite interesting, because we also, when we set the system up, we registered for the Renewable Heat Incentive, which is a government strategy, so we get money back for the heat that we generate through the heat pump system. And then, so that's something that as a group we then get some money back from it, and then we decide what to do with it, what to do with that money. So it's a really interesting sort of communal act in itself, if you like, managing that system and thinking about the kind of benefits from it. But there's lots of conversations about, how hot's your water coming out of your tap versus mine, and we have all these sort of little ongoing to and froing about it. But it's a real source of conversation, but it works very well, and we basically have a kind of plentiful supply of hot water and what have you, although it's a slightly lower temperature than it might be in most people's homes.
I think it's fascinating that apart from the sustainability aspect, using it to create a communal and financial benefit is wonderful. As architects, we are really often oriented towards I have to be sustainable because that's what the law says, or because it is an obligation towards the planet. But you don't consider the other positive side effects that this might have. If you do follow a sustainable course throughout your design, you might get more out of it than you would if you just use mechanical things all over and made it a very not planet-oriented project.
Absolutely. I mean, we've also done a lot of work around trying to improve the kind of the ecology of the wider site. I mean, obviously a farm in itself is a sort of semi-natural environment, but within the farmyard and around it, there's a lot of space, but it's not necessarily full of kind of a sort of broad ecotone, if you like. And so we've tried to do lots of things, planting trees, kind of whether that's hedgerow, or whether that's a kind of native orchard, grow a lot of various kind of fruit and veg at different times of year, although that doesn't self-sustain the group or anything. But also the farmyard itself was quite a hard kind of environment, obviously for moving livestock around, and we're slowly trying to kind of bring a bit more kind of greenery into that, using, you know, green roofs where we can and developing the site in different ways. So that's an ongoing process, but it's a big part of what we do, and again it's that sort of communal act of doing that together, working towards a common goal, which is really helpful.
And I think it adds a level of personality to the project. So you're not just designing for anybody. You're designing because you want it to be a more soft landscape, because you want a specific characteristic in the way that the houses interact or the landscape is placed around it. So it makes it both sustainable and personal.
Yes, yeah, and I think something that I haven't really touched upon is whilst everybody owns their own house, all of the landscape is shared. So no one has their own garden. As soon as you step outside your back or front door, essentially you're in shared space. And whilst people are respectful of areas that are sort of close to your house, fundamentally that is all shared. So I think, again, it's this sort of idea that you don't own a little bit of outdoor space which is called your garden. It's all part of what we do, and therefore the way that we look after that and develop it is something that generates a lot of conversation, a lot of activity, and sometimes some difficult situations where people can't agree. And that is all part of it, and it's difficult at the time, but also when you manage to kind of move beyond that, I think that can be really important and can be a real positive. But it's not always easy, and we don't always get it absolutely right, but I think it's important to have those conversations. We do try to do that, but there's a number of families living there during COVID, for instance, and you know, when you get sort of government law or guidance saying that you can't go outside your own garden because you're not supposed to mix with people, and yet all of our outdoor space is shared, what happens? There's no guidance for co-housing groups during COVID and how you deal with that. So I think as well, there's so many situations, scenarios over the time of the project where you are, in a very small way, kind of having to think about how to interpret policy and different guidance in a way that other people haven't really had to go through before.
That's an interesting difference with other projects, especially housing projects, and it has its own challenges, as with every human interaction or any urban interaction, because even in the cityscape, we have to interact with other people.
Sure.
So that's really interesting to hear. And I think that now that we've got a really good overview of what the Open House Co-housing project is, Leo, what do you think is the importance of having co-housing projects now that you have been through the process of creating one and seeing it through?
We're still learning, we're still finding out as we go through, but I think on a sort of an interpersonal level within the kind of co-housing group, as I said, it's quite small, it's made up of lots of different sort of friends and family groups. The intergenerational benefit is brilliant, and it's something which has helped us all. So the kind of support of grandparents or people who are retired supporting, looking after small children, childcare whilst working people are doing that is really important and something that we all benefit from in lots of different ways. And then the converse of that, which is elderly people being very much involved in a community, so they're not isolated, so they're always being kind of involved in what's going on, and they're there, they can come out and everybody joins in with what's going going on. So there's loads of benefits there. And I think generally just kind of support for people at different times. A lot of people that live there, we've got police officers, we've got doctors and nurses who are part of the group. And, all of that kind of shift work where you're coming in at different times of day is a real challenge for lots of people in their working lives. And I think in some small way as well, the kind of co-housing is quite nice for that because, again, there's always someone around. There's that kind of passive security that goes on because there's always people around at different times, and we can support each other with the kind of day-to-day challenges and problems that we face, whether it's giving someone a lift somewhere or helping them out, going to the doctors or whatever else. That's really positive. It's just those things that make life a little bit easier. And, if you've got good neighbours, that can happen in other situations. But it's just a little bit more cohesiveness, I guess, within co-housing, which is really helpful and beneficial.
It encourages this togetherness and this cooperation between members of different houses. So even though you're not living in the same space, you're kind of interacting as if you're in your own community. And that's really beautiful. We don't see it really often necessarily today. So it's lovely to hear that it actually brings in day-to-day life really nice interactions and really helpful interactions between members of those houses.
Yeah, and I think it's not just internal as well. I think one of the criticisms of sort of co-housing groups and other intentional communities is that they are kind of inward-looking or insular, and that it's a sort of gated community or it's not open to anybody else. And I think that's something that we're aware of. We do have neighbours, quite a few of them around the site, and we do try and make sure we've got good communication with them so that help with any kind of issues that we've got or support each other in different ways. And I think rather than it being that sense that it's us against the world, I think actually coming together as a group helps us interact with people around us in a better way because there's more chance for communication and conversation and linking things up, which is really good. So we're sort of, we've got a number of people involved in the local kind of action team who do kind of litter picking and that sort of thing. We can get involved in lots of other things. So in a way, I'd like to think that we're not like that we don't just, it's not just about what goes on within our walls, and that actually because of our collective, we're better at interacting with people outside the group than we would be if we were just an individual household.
Yeah, because when you're already a part of a community, you're more likely to expand that rather than turn inwards. So you get those positive interactions or initiatives to have interactions with other people. And that's really nice, especially in today's urbanization, where everybody tends to be a bit isolated into their own house, where you might have just two people or even one single person living. And I think that might make it as well more affordable for the members that live in those houses, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think the financial side of things and the affordability is a challenge for any co-housing group. And I think it has been for us in particular because we've done some of the work ourselves. The organisation develops each of the houses. We've had to be really careful about the finances of it so that a number of the families that live there have had to sell their house before they can move in. And because of the way we're doing development, we've had a caravan on site for a long time, very grand designs, isn't it? It was real. A number of families had to live in that, so sell the house, move into the caravan whilst the new house is being constructed. So we've had to be really kind of careful and try to be as supportive as we can during that process. It does cost money, but I think the value that we've achieved through our team effort towards the construction has made it as affordable as possible. And we've tried to keep that balance between kind of quality, because we need to do that because of the buildings and the importance of them, which is important to us. But we've also tried to make it something that is financially achievable and not ridiculously expensive. And I think we've just about done that. People have moved from other houses within Sheffield, but some people have moved from different parts of the country. So it's sort of trying to strike that balance. But I think generally the value of the kind of the buildings that we've managed to do is kind of pretty, I think, financially realistic for a number of kind of middle income families to join in, I'd say. It's not cheap, but it's not ridiculously expensive either.
That's an issue that we've got with all houses today, don't we? The housing crisis is worldwide at this point, and you can never be overly satisfied with the prices that you will find. So making it as affordable as possible, and perhaps even reducing day-to-day life costs with the renewable energies and the way that the houses function, that's also really positive.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we pride ourselves on that where we can. And I think we do the support of each other within the group, I think does help to keep some sort of everyday costs a bit lower. And that is a big part of what we do and what we're trying to achieve. I think we could do more on that front. But yeah, it's a kind of constant and an ongoing conversation.
There's always room for making projects better and improving even really specific aspects of them. So as architects, I think that's something we will always have to think about. Leo, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much for joining us today. I think everybody will agree that this project sounds fascinating. If anybody wants to check this project, we will link it in our description of the podcast because I think it is really worth to visualize it as well as listen to the specifics of it. And once again, Leo, it's been a pleasure to have you in the studio. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Daphne. I've really enjoyed it.
And thank you, listeners, for tuning in to Off the Drawing Board today. We will see you at the next episode.